Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Miss Barner. Let's have a history lesson. So, our lesson today is about the westward expansion, moving out west, and specifically concentrating on diversity within that expansion. Today, we're going to look at African Americans moving from the South to the West. And right after the Civil War, there was a great expansion, moving from the South of African Americans to states like Kansas and Oklahoma. The first migration of African Americans from the South westward was known as the Exodusters, leaving the South in places of Kentucky, Tennessee, South Carolina, North Carolina, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi. These states moved all the way to Kansas. Kansas was seen as a go-to state for opportunity and a better life. The last time we talked about the westward expansion, we talked about a different group of people. So let's review what we learned last time. So let's stand up, hand up, pair up, and discuss what we learned last time. So once you stand, hold your hand up. You don't have to talk yet. Just hold your hand up. And once you hold your hand up, look for someone else who has their hand up and pair up with that individual. You will be their partner and you're going to discuss for 2 minutes something that you learned from our last lesson on yesterday. Okay? Now that you've spoken to that partner, let's try this again. Hands up. We don't have to talk right now. Let's look for another partner with their hand up, pair up, and spend 2 minutes discussing something that you learned from our last lesson. Go. 2 minutes is up. All right, so let's get into the next part of our lesson. So let's discuss my expectations for this lesson. While we are in class today, we will have a lot of opportunities to work in groups. So I want to discuss what that looks like and how we're going to have a successful day learning about this next part of the westward expansion. Number 1, respect yourself and others as well as your teacher. Number 2, say it with me, put forth your best effort at all times. Number 3, make sure you're prepared before we start. Number 4, follow directions when given. Not afterwards, not later, not when you think you should, but immediately after they're given. And number 5, you know it's my favorite, pay attention, ask questions, and participate. We always review our objectives with an I can statement. Because once you're done learning, you will be able to do what you're saying you're going to do. I can explain reasons why African Americans moved westward. I can describe how life was for African Americans after the Civil War. With every new lesson, we learn new vocabulary. So let's go over some vocabulary words that I put on the board here. And then we're going to find the definitions. And I am going to see if you are saying these words within your groups. Now that you have those vocabulary words and you have written them down in your social studies journal, let's move on to do a grouped pair reading. You're going to use hand up, stand up, pair up to find a partner. Once you have found your partner, clap twice. All right. Now that you've found your partner and you're in pairs, I would like pairs to find a different pair and form a group of 4. Once you have your group of 4, sit at a group table. As you walked in the class, I gave you all a list of burning questions. Remember, burning questions are questions that guide our reading while we're reading our text. In your groups of 4, everyone has a duty. We're going to have 1 reader and 3 scribes. The scribes are responsible for writing answers to the burning questions. Here are the expectations for the reader. The reader is supposed to read clearly and at a volume that everyone can hear. That's going to be at a volume 2. Remember, we're all in this class together and we have several groups. So we don't want to be too loud. You have to stop in between paragraphs in case the scribe finds information that they want to write down to answer those burning questions. Continue to the next paragraph after you see that everyone in your group has written something down. If no one is writing, proceed to the next paragraph. Scribes, while the reader is reading, your only job is to write and listen. Just in case you need to see exactly what the reader is reading, I will post the text on the board. Once you hear my timer go off, you are finished and should put everything down so that we can continue to the next part of our lesson. Because everyone met expectations during our first group activity, I'm really proud of you guys. You have a reward after class. Okay, now for our next activity, I want you guys to come up with questions, your own burning questions for this lesson. You've already read the text. I've already given you some information about the expansion. Now, I want you to come up with your own questions that you think will help you know or learn more about this topic. Do not ask questions that are closed in. Ask open-ended questions. What do I mean by that? I want you to ask questions that require an explanation. It can't be questions that can easily give a yes or no or maybe answer or one-word answers. There must be questions that will require an explanation. I'm going to give you 5 minutes as a group to come up with at least 4 burning questions. Okay, in your groups, I want you guys to discuss answers to those questions based on what you've already read. And if you can't come up with answers to those questions, we're going to discuss some of those in whole group. While we're getting ready to go back to whole group and everyone sits at their own desk, I want to play a song to you called Strange Fruit. This is by an artist called Billie Holiday. I'm having you listen to this song because it gives an example of what African Americans were facing during the time of living in the South right after the Civil War. So I want you to listen to this song, listen to the words, and we're going to start our group discussion right after that. Some of the reason that African Americans moved westward after the Civil War, it was rough, it was bad before because they were living as slaves, but now they've been declared to be free, but they still don't feel free. It's nothing worse to have a hope and a dream taken away from you, even after the law supports it. And now African Americans are living in the South with poor living conditions, no jobs, or they're being overworked and underpaid. And they're not able to live a fruitful and free life as they would have hoped. So one reason that African Americans moved westward was because they wanted better opportunities. Kansas was a free state. This was a state that was often sought after for slaves who were running away before the Civil War. Now that African Americans are free from slavery and they're living independent lives, now they want to move to Kansas so they can experience what they hope for. You can see that in the South there was quite an increase in violence and terroristic acts against African Americans after the Civil War. The song that we listened to, Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday, gives an account of the artist's experience with African Americans in large numbers in the South being hanged, something called lynching. These were hate crimes. There was no justice for this. People rarely were arrested, let alone sent to jail. So people wanted to feel safe. People wanted to go, live in a place where they felt protected, in a place where they didn't have to have so much hostility and hate and violence be such a huge part of their life. They wanted to go somewhere where they can just be themselves and live a life that they deserve to live. Another reason they wanted to move to Kansas is because they wanted to have political freedom. In the South, a lot of violence took place because there were African Americans who wanted the right to vote, who wanted the right to run for an office. So they believed that they would receive more freedom to vote or to run for office in Kansas, in other states other than the South. Also, African Americans wanted to buy and own their own land. It was very rare for African Americans to own their own land in the South. A lot of people left without jobs, without money, just desperate to leave, find work in the next town, and build a new life. While African Americans suffered a lot of hostility from other white citizens in the South and hate groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, they were met with even more hostility. In the state of Kansas, they had even more of a pushback, in that there were opportunities that they wanted that they weren't able to get. For instance, in the town of Nicodemus, Kansas, African Americans wanted a railroad, and they were denied the opportunity to have a railroad by the Union Pacific Railroad. And this happened even though the city in which they lived in, a great area to have a railroad. The reason they wanted to have a railroad is because that was a great means of transportation. If you had a railroad that was in your town at the time, you would get more goods and services that would come in your way. You were able to send things out. People were able to travel to you a lot faster, because if they didn't have a railroad, they weren't able to travel by train. They would have to walk, ride by horse. So if you had a railroad that was in your town was wealthier because more people were coming, more people were working. The railroad was the life of a small town. Nicodemus, Kansas was a small town, and it was heavily populated with African Americans. And unfortunately, they didn't get a railroad, but they continued to thrive, and the population continued to increase nevertheless. Once African Americans were able to settle into Kansas, they were able to start their own businesses. They started becoming self-employed. They also worked for other people, but there was a large percentage of the population that actually worked for themselves. So they became entrepreneurs. Here's a better look at the data that was displayed before. You can see that a large amount of African Americans compared to other groups were working for themselves. What's even more interesting to me is the fact that a lot of those entrepreneurs are African Americans that came from the hostile South and areas where they were really oppressed. Came from very humble starts and made a great life for themselves. Other African Americans from other cities or towns, even in free states, decided that they would move to Kansas too. Here in this slide, you can see two of very prominent entrepreneurs of Nicodemus, Kansas. They were from Chicago. And this serves as an example that not only African Americans from the South migrated to Kansas, but from other areas in the Midwest as well. What's interesting to me is that Mr. Maccabee here at the bottom has settled in Nicodemus, Kansas, and decided that it may be best for African Americans to live in their own state or in communities separate from other races and other cultures and nationalities. He thought it would be best for African Americans to live alone. And this idea is known as separatism. And there are many reasons why one would want something like this, but in this time, it was mainly because of the need for safety. There are a lot of African Americans who were colonists. They came as a group of settlers and moved to Kansas or other western states and found land, and with their own money that they combined, they were able to purchase land and live in that area. I believe this ad is really profound because it's evidence that African Americans wanted to leave the South for a variety of reasons. Some were looking especially for economic improvement, while other people were just trying to escape from brutality and terrorism. Also, once a lot of African Americans started migrating towards the West, you had opportunities for leadership that wanted more African Americans to migrate from the South westward. Two of the most prominent figures who were great leaders were Benjamin Singleton of Tennessee, Henry Adams of Louisiana. Both men wanted African Americans to move from the South and start better lives up north or in the West. The migration of African Americans from the South to the West did not only get the attention of other African Americans, but it also got the attention of Congress, and they conducted an investigation to find out why so many African Americans were migrating. The investigation that was conducted by the U.S. Senate was covered in an article by Damani Davis, and his beginning text is what really captures the means for moving and the experiences that pushed people from their homes to a land they've never been to. So this is what was discussed in the investigation conducted by the U.S. Congress. Once they've listened to everyone's testimonies, they didn't make a decision on whether or not the terroristic acts that happened in the South should be sought after or brought to justice. It just kind of ended and didn't have any positive results, unfortunately. Now, considering everything that we've learned about the westward migration from the South to Kansas and other western states for African Americans, I want you to think about what we've learned about other settlers from other cultures who moved westward versus those who are African American. We're going to compare and contrast some reasons why they left and moved westward. And we also want to compare and contrast their lives before migration. So now let's transition and think about, what if you were in a colony? Remember, we talked about groups of African Americans who came together to purchase land when they moved west, and they lived together as a group. Imagine the people in your group are a colony. I want you to think about these things. Give me the name of your colony. Give me a reason why you are in a colony. Where are you from? What kind of life are you looking for after leaving and migrating north or to the west? All right, you guys, I've had an excellent time with you today. We had a great lesson. I appreciate everyone's participation. But before you leave, I want you guys to take your exit slips and hand those in before it's time for you to go. Thank you for tuning in again to Miss Varner's TV. I appreciate your time today, and I hope you learned something new and interesting about the westward expansion.